The envelope lay on my kitchen counter, simple, cream-colored, yet heavier than anything I had ever held. I picked it up, feeling the weight of its words even before I opened it. Heirs only. No dead ends. Do not bring your daughter. I stared at it, reading it over and over. My father's handwriting was as precise and cold as I remembered. Each letter deliberate. Each word a tiny punch to the gut. I am Ethan Miller, 34 years old, divorced, father to Lucy, my 10-year-old daughter, and the only person in this world who truly matters to me. She had been my reason to keep going after the divorce, after the heartbreak, after the years of my family's cold judgment. And yet here it was, black and white. According to my father, Lucy was a dead end. Lucy peeked over my shoulder. Her eyes, wide and trusting, met mine. "Daddy, can I come?" she asked softly. I crouched down to her level, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently, smiling. "This time, we're going somewhere they'll remember." The night of my father's birthday arrived. The mansion stood like a fortress, perfectly lit, perfectly polished. A monument to wealth and control. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, the kind that gleamed like jewels under the evening lights. Inside, the grand hall echoed with the soft clinking of champagne glasses, polite laughter, and the hum of people pretending to care about each other. I held Lucy's hand firmly as we walked through the entrance. She looked up at the towering chandelier, her innocent wonder contrasting sharply with the cold formality surrounding us. She had braided her own hair that morning, crooked but proud, and wore her favorite yellow dress. I could see the pride in her eyes, the hope that her grandparents would welcome her. I watched my father before he saw us. He was tall, his posture perfect, his expression calm, an image of authority he had perfected over decades. He moved through the room with the quiet confidence of someone used to command. His eyes scanned the crowd, expecting to see the usual carefully curated guests, the obedient relatives, the sycophants who never challenged him. Then he saw me, and Lucy. The change was immediate. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of something unsteady in him. Confusion. I stepped forward, holding Lucy's hand firmly. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said calmly. "I brought someone you didn't expect." The room went silent. Conversations halted mid-laugh. Glasses hovered in the air, eyes turned toward us. Whispers began to ripple across the polished marble floor. Lucy stepped forward on her own, her small hand clutching a carefully sealed envelope. "This is for you, Grandpa," she said politely, holding it out. Her innocence, her unshakable courage, made the room hold its breath. My father's eyes darted between me and her, searching for authority, for control, for some way to reclaim the narrative. But in that moment, he had none. I could see the tightness in my mother's face, the way her lips pressed together as she tried to remain composed. She had always believed she could control everything. The family, the social image, the narrative. But the envelope in Lucy's tiny hands was a disruption she had never anticipated. Lucy's voice rang clear in the quiet hall. "Grandpa, it's very important." My father's hands twitched involuntarily. The room felt heavy, the air thick with tension. He wanted to shout, to command, to assert himself as he always had. But the words wouldn't come. For the first time, the authority he had wielded for decades felt hollow. I knelt down slightly, whispering to Lucy, "You're doing great, sweetheart. Just hand it over." Her eyes sparkled with trust. She had no idea of the storm she was unleashing. She only knew she was following my instructions, and I had taught her well. The envelope slipped into my father's hand. He opened it with trembling fingers, and as he read, I saw transformation begin. The arrogance fading, the control unraveling, the unshakable certainty of his world cracking. Just a little. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The room was holding its breath, the guests realizing that something monumental was happening. I watched my father's carefully curated image of power and dominance begin to crumble under the weight of truth. Lucy looked up at me, her small face full of pride and innocence. Did I do it right, Daddy? I smiled, brushing her hair gently. Perfectly, sweetheart. Perfectly. The night was far from over. This was just the beginning. The door my parents had tried to keep closed on my daughter had been cracked open, and the consequences would not be silent. The envelope in my father's hands wasn't just a card. It wasn't a birthday greeting with a polite excuse tucked inside. It was something much more powerful proof. Legal proof. Evidence of the control my father thought he had over our lives, and the inheritance he had tried to hoard. Lucy watched nervously, her small hands fidgeting at her sides. "Daddy, are they angry?" she asked softly. I crouched beside her. "No, sweetheart. They're realizing something very important. And sometimes, realizing is worse than being angry." Inside that cream-colored envelope were copies of documents my great-grandmother had entrusted to me years ago. They outlined her estate, the family trust, and most importantly, Lucy's direct entitlement to a portion of the family holdings. Assets my father had assumed would remain untouchable were now hers, legally, without question. I had never wanted revenge for the sake of cruelty, but I had always wanted justice. And this was justice served quietly, precisely, and undeniably. The moment my father scanned the documents, I could see the change. The confidence he carried into the party, the arrogance that had always made him untouchable in social circles, was evaporating. His eyes flicked nervously to my mother. She stiffened, realizing this was more than just a minor embarrassment. It was a loss of control. Aunts, uncles, and family friends began to murmur, noticing the tension. No one understood fully what was happening, but they could sense the disruption. The envelope was small, but it carried enough weight to shake decades of assumed authority. My mother, ever the perfectionist, attempted to regain composure. She smiled tightly at a few guests, nodded politely, and whispered reassuring words that fell flat. The damage had been done. Lucy tugged gently at my sleeve. "Daddy, are they going to be mean?" I shook my head. "No, baby. They just didn't expect the truth to show up at their party." I watched my father closely. His hand shook slightly as he held the documents. The edges were crisp, the signatures undeniable. He had been careful with everything, careful with money, careful with appearances, careful with controlling everyone, but this was untouchable. The room held its breath. Every eye was on us. I let silence do the work. Silence speaks louder than any accusation when it's combined with truth. Then my father tried to speak. "Ethan, I don't," I interrupted gently, holding Lucy's hand firmly. "Dad, you had years to make sure she mattered. You didn't. Now you'll see why that matters." He faltered. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. Their authority had crumbled quietly, and the social sphere that once carried their influence began to sense it. People began to ask questions, subtle, polite, but probing. Who owned what? How had this child become an heir? Why hadn't anyone told them? I stayed calm. That was always the plan. Let them react. Let the world watch. My daughter didn't need to fight. She didn't need to yell. She only needed to exist, to hold her place, and to follow through with the inheritance that had always been hers. Lucy smiled up at me, her innocence shining, unaware of the weight of her actions. She had disrupted the carefully constructed world of my parents without malice, without anger. All she had done was show up. My father dropped the envelope on the table, his hands trembling slightly. This can't be right," he whispered. I leaned back, holding Lucy close. "It is right, Dad. And it's been right for a long time. You just never wanted to see it." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. My parents tried to continue the party, tried to pretend nothing had happened, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had noticed the small envelope in Lucy's hands and the way it had shifted the room. As we left, I looked back at my father. He didn't meet my eyes. For the first time in decades, he was powerless, and he knew it. Lucy held my hand tightly, her smile proud and unaware of the storm she had unleashed. She had no idea how monumental her simple act had been, but she didn't need to. I did, and I would make sure the consequences unfolded exactly as they should. The door they thought they controlled had been cracked open, and I could feel the slow, inevitable consequences beginning. The next steps would be quiet, careful, and devastating, but I would not rush them. Patience, strategy, and justice were far more satisfying than hasty revenge. The days after my father's birthday passed in an uneasy quiet. No calls, no messages, no dramatic confrontations, just silence. But I knew my parents well enough to understand that silence, in their world, meant panic. I'm Ethan Miller, and for most of my life, I had been trained to believe power came from control over money, reputation, and people. My father had mastered that art, or at least, he thought he had. What he didn't realize was that control only works when everyone believes in it. And after that night, belief had started to crack. The first sign came from someone unexpected, my Uncle Richard. He called me late one evening, his voice careful. "Ethan, people are asking questions." I didn't sound surprised. "About Lucy?" A pause. "About ownership. About the trust. About why no one ever mentioned her before." I looked at Lucy sitting on the floor beside me, coloring peacefully. She hummed softly, unaware that adults across the city were whispering her name in boardrooms and private dining rooms. "That's interesting," I said calmly. "I guess the truth has a way of surfacing. At work, I noticed it too. Business partners who once treated my father like an untouchable authority now spoke more cautiously. Conversations lowered when his name came up. Meetings ended with vague smiles and unfinished sentences. My father's power hadn't vanished overnight, but it was leaking slowly, publicly, irreversibly. Lucy asked one morning, "Daddy, why do people look at us differently now?" I knelt beside her. "Because sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them until they're forced to." At home, my parents' house had become quieter. Invitations slowed. The steady stream of guests who once filled their weekends dwindled. Reputation didn't collapse loudly, it eroded. My mother finally called. Her voice was measured, controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "Ethan, we need to talk." "We already did," I replied. "You just didn't listen." She exhaled sharply. "You embarrassed your father. You embarrassed the family." I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "No, the truth did." Lucy just carried it into the room. She fell silent. That silence felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. At a charity gala 2 weeks later, the shift became impossible to ignore. My father stood among people who once orbited him with admiration. Now they nodded politely and moved on. Conversations redirected. Power, I realized, wasn't something you owned, it was something people lent you. And my father's loan had been quietly revoked. I stood across the room with Lucy, who clutched my hand nervously. "Daddy, do they hate me?" she whispered. I crouched down, looking her straight in the eyes. "No, sweetheart. They're afraid of what you represent." "What do I represent?" I smiled. "Change." My parents noticed. Of course they did. They noticed the empty seats at their table, the missed calls, the polite excuses. They noticed that when lawyers spoke now, they spoke slowly, carefully, no longer assuming my father's dominance. Then came the letter. Not Tome, to Lucy, a formal acknowledgement of her status within the trust, sent by a firm that had worked with my family for decades. My father hadn't authorized it. He hadn't needed to. The documents had done their work. Lucy brought it to me, eyes wide. "Daddy, is this mine?" I took a breath. "It is. But more importantly, it's protection. For you." That night, my father called. His voice was lower than I'd ever heard it. "Ethan, we need to resolve this privately." I leaned back, watching Lucy fall asleep on the couch beside me. "You had years to resolve things privately. You chose public exclusion instead. This is damaging," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "That's what happens when you build power on denial." He didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth was doing its work far more efficiently than I ever could. Lucy shifted in her sleep, murmuring something soft and unintelligible. I covered her with a blanket. my chest tight with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. My parents hadn't just underestimated me. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, they had handed me the most effective form of revenge imaginable. One that required no shouting, no confrontation, no cruelty, just patience. And the world was already choosing sides. The weeks after the birthday party were quiet, too quiet. At first, my parents tried to pretend nothing had happened. Calls came, polite and measured, as if they were testing the waters. Invitations to family dinners, casual brunches, even small gatherings. Slowly, they were all subtly declined. They thought distance would save them. It didn't, because the truth has weight, and the truth never stays buried. Lucy didn't understand fully yet. She only noticed the sudden changes in her grandmother's friends, the hesitant glances from family acquaintances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when we walked by. I did. I noticed. I watched. The envelope from the birthday party had done more than embarrass my father. It had set the stage for legal reinforcement. Margaret, my great-grandmother, had left detailed instructions. Every property, trust, and account had contingencies to ensure Lucy's position was unassailable. And I had followed those instructions exactly. The first visible impact came in the form of letters formal, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Banks froze certain lines of credit. Trustees requested immediate documentation for assets my father had assumed were untouchable. Contractors and service providers began to hesitate, requesting proof of authority that my father could no longer fully provide. He tried to act. Of course he did. My father had spent a lifetime believing that a strong voice could command loyalty. He tried phone calls, polite emails, and even a private meeting with me at a cafe. "I don't understand," he said quietly, his hands clutching a coffee cup like it was an anchor. All of this, it shouldn't be possible." I leaned back, calm and deliberate. "It is possible. You just built a house on assumptions, and assumptions collapse when reality arrives." He swallowed. His pride, one of the few things I had never managed to touch, was crumbling slowly but surely. Meanwhile, social pressure grew. Friends, neighbors, and business partners began noticing the subtle shifts in power. Invitations my father had once expected were now quietly declined. References that had been taken for granted were now verified thoroughly, and his reputation as an unchallenged authority began to erode. My mother finally called me one evening. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to mask it with practiced composure. "Ethan, this is getting out of control. We need to resolve this." I didn't respond immediately. I watched Lucy, playing with her toys nearby, humming softly, blissfully unaware of the storms swirling around her grandparents. "I know," I said at last, "and you're too late. The storm has already begun." She paused, as if considering my words. "Daddy, will they ever understand?" I smiled faintly. "They will, but only when it's too late to matter." The legal framework we had set in motion ensured that any attempt to reclaim authority would fail. Every move they made was countered quietly by documents, contingencies, and careful oversight. Every interaction with lawyers, banks, and trustees reminded them that they no longer held power. And yet, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching them flounder in silence was far more satisfying than any outburst of anger or confrontation could ever be. One evening, I received a call from the family lawyer. "Mr. Miller, your father and mother have requested a meeting. They want to discuss reconciliation or settlement." I didn't reply immediately. I placed the phone down, looked at Lucy reading quietly on the couch, and let her small hand brush against mine. "They're finally realizing what matters, Daddy," she said softly. "Yes, baby," I whispered. "They are, and they're learning the hard way." By the end of the week, my parents' desperation had become palpable. Subtle inquiries, polite confrontations, and carefully worded questions filled their days. And yet, every attempt to regain control was met with patience, calm authority, and the quiet power of documents and foresight. No shouting, no anger, no public drama, just the unstoppable force of truth, legality, and preparation. For the first time in decades, my parents understood one thing clearly. Control is only an illusion. And the child they dismissed had all the real power. As I tucked Lucy into bed that night, she looked up at me with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are they gone?" I kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart. They're still around. But the door they thought they controlled is closed now. And it will never open again unless you want it to." And with that, a long chapter of quiet revenge drew to its inevitable close. The storm was ready to break, and I knew the final act would be unforgettable. The meeting happened on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy and unmoving. My parents had requested it through their lawyer, careful and formal, as if distance and procedure could soften the damage already done. I arrived alone. Lucy stayed home. This wasn't her burden to carry anymore. She had already done more than enough. My father looked older, not just tired, smaller. The man who once filled every room with authority now sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes avoiding mine. My mother tried to hold herself together, but the tension showed in the way her fingers clenched her purse. "We never meant to hurt her," my mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly. "That's the problem. You never thought about her at all." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, this was the kind that forces reflection. My father cleared his throat. "You've made your point, Ethan." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something unexpected. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel triumph either. What I felt was distance. A clean, permanent distance. "This was never about making a point," I said calmly. "It was about making sure Lucy would never need your permission to exist." They didn't argue. They couldn't. Every legal pathway had closed. Every attempt at negotiation had been anticipated years in advance. This wasn't revenge driven by emotion, it was protection driven by foresight. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Can we still be part of her life?" I hesitated. Then I answered honestly, "That won't be my decision. It will be hers. When she's old enough. If she wants it." That was the moment it truly sank in for them. They had lost control forever. Not because I took it, but because they gave it away, piece by piece, every time they dismissed her. We stood to leave. My father stopped me at the door. "Ethan," I turned. "You should have been proud of me," he said quietly. I nodded once. You should have been proud of her. Outside, the air felt lighter, cleaner. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. At home, Lucy ran to me, smiling wide. "Daddy, you're back!" I knelt down, holding her close. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm back." "Are they okay?" she asked softly. "They'll be fine," I said. "They're just learning something new." "What?" "That love isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn." She smiled, satisfied with that answer, and went back to her drawings. Watching her, I understood the final truth of it all. Real revenge doesn't destroy. It redefines power. My parents had built their lives on exclusion, hierarchy, and control. I built mine on patience, preparation, and love. And in the end, the door they slammed shut on my daughter became the one they would never walk through again. Not because I locked it, but because she no longer needed what was on the other side.